Walls of Destiny. Part 2. Beyond the Walls. Chapter 11. Wyrd Fortunes. Mylo lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness, his mind foggy and disoriented. Each time he woke, he was aware of only fleeting thoughts, comfortable, safe, and warm, as though he were lying in a cozy cottage back home. Was it a dream? Was he in his own bed, free from the peril he'd just faced? All he could grasp was the sensation of comfort and the overwhelming urge to sleep, to let go. At last, he awoke fully, though he had no sense of time. A wild-looking, hairy man stood over him, holding a cup of milk. "Drink, drink," the man urged, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. Mylo took the cup, his hands unsteady. The man's appearance reminded him of the beastmen legends from the northern woods of Atlantia, their appearance exaggerated in the tales his elders had told. "Thank you," Mylo managed, sipping the milk. "Where am I?" "You're in my home," the man answered matter-of-factly. "I am Holthor." "Mylo," he replied, his voice thick with exhaustion. As Holthor set a plate of food before him, Mylo continued, "What became of the witch?" "Witch?" Holthor laughed, a deep, hearty sound. "There are no witches here. This is the wilds of the woods, lad. Not much of anyone around, except up by the lake. And that's just the way I like it. Most folk, they're nothing but trouble." Mylo frowned. "Then why did you help me?" Holthor's laugh rumbled again, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I'm not a savage. I couldn't just leave you to die. Besides, I reckon you must be on some great and important quest if you're all the way up here risking your life." Mylo hesitated, chewing slowly. "You mentioned the lake. Do you know where the ferry is? I need to get there." Holthor raised an eyebrow. "I can take you there, but you're in no shape to be riding yet. You're weak, feverish. Rest for a while." "I must go," Mylo protested, struggling to sit up. "I can't afford to waste any more time." All right, Holthor sighed, his gruff voice softening. "But at least drink some tea. It does wonders for the body." It was an hour before Mylo felt strong enough to ride, though the fever still clung to him. As they traveled, Holthor guided him off course, revealing a more direct path than Mylo had been following. They made their way through the dense forest until, finally, they reached the lake. It stretched wide in front of them, the horizon fading into mist. At the edge of the water, a small village huddled near a cluster of wooden homes. "The ferry's just beyond the village," Holthor said, pointing toward a dock where a boat bobbed on the water. As they approached, a group of small children ran up to Holthor, their eyes wide with curiosity. They giggled and ducked behind trees, watching the imposing man on horseback. With a mischievous grin, Holthor lunged playfully at them, growling like a wild animal. The children screamed, but their laughter followed as they scampered away, shrieking with delight. Mylo smiled weakly, then turned back to Holthor. "Thank you so much for everything. I have money. I can pay you for your trouble." Holthor waved it off with a laugh. "Nonsense. I'm happy to help. And as for money, I've no use for it. Your thanks is enough for me." Shrieking with delight. They reached the ferry, where the ferryman was preparing to depart. Holthor pointed. "You're in luck. The ferryman's about to leave." "Thank you again," Mylo said, feeling a surge of gratitude. "I owe you my life." Holthor chuckled. "No debt between us. If you're ever lost in these woods again, just call for Holthor. I'll be here." As Mylo turned toward the ferry, his mind raced. There was one question he still needed answered. One more thing. Holthor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "How is it that you speak New Cimmerian so well, living so far from everyone?" Mylo asked, his curiosity piqued. Holthor gave a sly grin. "I speak many languages, Mylo. Good luck to you, young man." Mylo waved, grabbing his belongings, and walked toward the ferry. The sun glittered off the water's surface, casting shimmering streaks across the lake. Despite the chill in the air, the warmth of the sun made the autumn morning feel far less cold than it should have. He climbed aboard the ferry, paid the ferryman, and took a seat. "We'll be leaving shortly," the ferryman called, glancing back at a cloaked figure standing near the bow. The man was silent, his face hidden, staring out over the water toward the distant northern shore. Mylo studied the figure from a distance. He caught the man's gaze once or twice, but the hooded stranger didn't seem to acknowledge him. A shiver ran down Mylo's spine at the eerie sight of the cloaked figure. Soon, more passengers boarded, a young couple with a donkey, an elderly man who looked like a scholar or professor, and another young man carrying a large backpack. Mylo moved to the other side of the ferry to make space for the donkey and sat down near the ferryman. He couldn't help himself. "Who is that fellow at the front of the boat?" Mylo whispered. The ferryman glanced up. "I don't know, lad, but I think he's headed to some sort of gathering." Mylo's heart quickened. "Of wizards?" he asked, a note of excitement in his voice. "Could be, I suppose," the ferryman replied, his voice flat. Of course, Mylo thought. What else could it be, if not a gathering of wizards, out here in the wild? Just then, the ferryman called out, "All right, all aboard. We're leaving now." He untied the rope and pushed off from the dock. Suddenly, a voice cried out from the shore. "Stop the boat." A woman's shriek pierced the air. "I need to cross." Mylo's blood ran cold as recognition hit him. It was the witch who had pursued him. She was chasing the ferry down the dock, Lauriad close behind her. The ferryman tried to toss the rope to the dock, but Mylo watched as the cloaked figure sprang to his feet, spinning toward the witch and Lauriad. With a sharp, fluid motion, the figure extended both hands, sending out a pulse of energy that seemed to propel the boat forward. The witch, in her haste, lost her footing and tumbled into the water with a splash. Lauriad reached her in an instant, pulling her from the water as she cursed and sputtered. "He will pay. He will pay for this," she shouted, shaking the water from her robes. "Stay calm. We shall get you dried off," Lauriad said, holding back his amusement. "You're not going to melt." "Oh, very funny," said the witch as she eyed the ferry. The ferryman stood frozen, watching the events unfold, while murmurs rippled through the other passengers. The cloaked figure, assessing the threat behind them, whispered an inaudible phrase and finally turned back around, seemingly unshaken. Mylo tried to devise a way to approach the mysterious man, to learn where he was headed and if he could accompany him. But each time he thought he had an opening, the man's face remained obscured in a shadow, a darkness that seemed unnatural. Mylo couldn't understand why he couldn't see the man's features, why his face appeared as if cloaked in a shroud of mist. It unsettled him deeply, gnawing at his thoughts like a creeping chill. Perhaps I should track him, like I did the others, Mylo thought, though the memory of how that had nearly cost him his life flashed in his mind. He quickly shoved it aside. As the ferry drew closer to the northern shore, a sense of unease settled over him. This was the farthest north he had ever ventured, and everything about the place felt wrong. The air seemed sharper, colder, as if even the land itself resented his presence. The shoreline was barren and rocky, the jagged boulders rising like silent sentinels, their edges sharp and unforgiving. The waves crashed relentlessly against the rocks, their roar like broken glass grinding against itself. There was no sign of merchants hawking their wares, or mad kings, or lively townsfolk, only these desolate mountains looming in the distance, cold and indifferent. The ferry slowly eased toward a battered pier. The couple with the donkey disembarked first, heading toward the darkened path that led into the wilderness. Mylo watched them, puzzled. Where could they possibly be going? His curiosity was momentarily distracted, but the unease gnawing at him quickly returned. The old man followed, his movement slow but deliberate. Then the young adventurer, his large pack swinging on his back, stepped off the boat. Each of them seemed eager to leave the ferry behind, as though the very air of this place was pushing them forward. Finally, the hooded figure rose. His eyes met Mylo's for the briefest moment, and a chill ran down Mylo's spine. The stranger's face remained hidden, shrouded in a thick mist that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. Perhaps if I angle myself differently, I can catch a glimpse of his face, Mylo thought, his gaze narrowing. But no matter which way he moved, no matter how he turned, the face stayed shrouded. Only those hauntingly familiar eyes were visible, watching him. Mylo slowly rose from his seat, his body stiff from the ride. He kept his distance, pretending to head in the opposite direction, but his eyes never left the hooded figure. The man's gaze followed him, unwavering as he strode toward the mountains. King Wolf II arrived in the city of Volsacima, his ornate carriage drawn by sleek, decorated horses. A retinue of 2 security guards and 2 drivers accompanied him, the air around them tense with the authority the king exuded. As they approached the palace of his son, Raybor, the commotion drew the prince's attention. He emerged to greet his father with a formal bow. "To what do I owe the honor of your visit, my father?" Raybor asked, his voice a mixture of curiosity and wariness, the Phoenician tongue rolling from his lips. "Should there be a reason for a king to visit his son in his beautiful city?" the king replied with an air of indifference, though his gaze was sharp as they entered the palace. Once inside, the 2 men sat at a long wooden table. "Fetch a bottle of our finest wine," the prince commanded, signaling to a servant. His eyes, however, lingered on his father with suspicion. "I sense there is more to your visit than you're letting on, father. Surely you didn't travel 4 days just to discuss the tides." The king chuckled darkly, his eyes glinting with a hidden meaning. He paused, letting the silence hang between them for a moment. Then he spoke, his tone serious. "You sense correctly." He leaned forward slightly. "Why do you insist on causing trouble with the Easterners?" "Father," the prince's voice grew tight with confusion. "I have gotten word that you have kidnapped 2 of them, and they rot in your dungeon as we speak." The king's words were like ice, freezing the air between them. "Kidnapped? They were trespassing in our land. We kidnapped no one." Raybor's protest was immediate, but the king was unmoved. "Your borders didn't seem so important when you were living it up in Idriaxlan, and who knows where else," the king shot back, his voice rising with barely controlled fury. Raybor began, but the king's anger cut him off. "I demand to see the prisoners at once," demanded the king as he stormed toward the door. The servant arrived with the wine, but before she could offer it, Raybor snatched the glasses from her hands, filling one with a full measure. He drained the cup in a single gulp, his eyes darkened with anger, before walking briskly outside, his father in tow. The dungeon entrance was outside, at the rear of the palace, a grim place that contrasted sharply with the opulence of the rooms above. There was a room at the top where the guards ate meals and conducted business, and a stairway leading down to the dungeon. The king sat at one of the desks and waited for the prisoners, his gaze never leaving the shadows that clung to the walls. "Let's go." Up the stairs, the guard barked at the prisoners, his voice mocking. "What good is all your exercise if you still move so slowly?" he taunted. Losgrel and Longfellow were brought before the king, their disheveled forms a stark contrast to the regal surroundings. They stank of filth and deprivation, but the king paid no mind. He sat across from them, his eyes cold and calculating as he studied them intently. The silence that followed stretched on, uncomfortable and heavy. The one or two guards understood the common tongue well enough. They waited for the translator to arrive. 15 minutes passed before the translator finally appeared, his steps measured as he approached the king. The king spoke to the translator in his native tongue, his voice low and commanding. "The king wants to know why you trespass in his land." Losgrel, though weary, straightened in his seat. "We came to speak to you," he said, his voice raspy, "to offer an alliance against the COL. "Against the COL?" the translator asked, brow furrowing. "Yes, we were sent by Burdock the Red. He wrote a letter in Venusian. We were to give it to you," Losgrel explained, his voice more resolute now. "Letter?" The king turned his gaze sharply toward his son. "You still have this letter, I trust?" Raybor rose without a word, his face hardening with impatience as he left to fetch the letter. The room remained silent as the two prisoners exchanged glances, their eyes filled with resignation. "Do we have your allegiance?" Losgrel asked, his voice carrying a mixture of hope and desperation. The translator relayed the words to the king, who did not immediately respond. Finally, he answered. "The king says you are bold to ask such a question. He says that remains to be seen. Your cooperation will determine much." "We've already told them." "We don't know where Mylo is," Losgrel insisted. "The king has no interest in this." "Mylo," the translator replied coldly. Just then, Raybor returned, holding the letter in his hands. The king examined it carefully, his eyes narrowing with thought. He turned toward his son, his voice stern. "Leave us," he commanded. Raybor shot his father a look of disdain, but said nothing, storming out of the room. The king leaned forward, his fingers tracing the edges of the letter before speaking again, this time in a low, measured voice. "The king has a proposition for you," the translator began. "He is willing to consider an alliance with those who oppose the COL. He knows of a wizard gathering in the mountains north of the country you call Ashdorn. Many wizards and non-wizards alike have been invited to represent their nations, tribes, and cities. However, Wolflandians are not welcome. It is likely your friend, this Burdock the Red, will be there at the gathering." The king paused, watching the prisoners carefully. "Even if not, with this letter, and the two of you, our representatives should be allowed entry. Your crime of trespassing will be forgiven if you agree to accompany our representatives to the gathering. There will be one of our wizards, one of our representatives, and a guide. What say you?" Longfellow looked at Losgrel and gave a desperate nod. "Yes, of course," said Losgrel. "Get them cleaned up and to my royal carriage," barked the king at one of the guards. Back at Enkad, the king, Adon, and 3 of the elders gathered in the war room. The air was heavy with unease as they solemnly discussed the impending collapse of northern Ashdorn. For the first time in years, the region's population had begun to rise again, recovering slowly from the devastation wrought by the volcanic eruption that had claimed countless lives and forced many to flee. Enkad was one of the few places to endure, but even it was ill-prepared for the full wrath of the COL. Thanks to Erenkad's return, the kingdom had maintained an unbroken line of kings since the time of the Great Plague. Yet, now, it all seemed in vain. The future looked grim. "I just don't know where else he could have hidden it," the king muttered, his brow furrowed with frustration. "It's always been behind a secret wall in the Great Room. How could he have moved it to the upper levels without anyone noticing? It doesn't make sense." "The tunnels have been searched?" asked Arnaz, one of the elders, his voice calm but laced with concern. "They've been searched. Not a single gold piece. The tunnels are too narrow for the proper equipment to move such a chest. Even if it were possible, there would be some sign of it," Erenkad replied, shaking his head. "Suppose he did move it to the upper levels, perhaps even out of the fortress," Arnaz suggested, but was cut off as a new voice interrupted. "News, my lord," the captain of the infantry entered breathlessly. "Our spies report that troops are on the move. They march toward us." The king leapt to his feet, his expression hardening. "Where? How many?" 5,000, my lord, the captain said. "Half COL soldiers, half Doka blue suits. They're coming from Doka, and they'll be here in 4 days." "DCA?" Adon murmured, his face darkening. They must think the elephant riders are still with us. They will make slaves of us, one of the elders added, his voice trembling with fear. We should flee to Atlantia. You're welcome to run, if you wish, the king said coldly, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the room. But if you do, don't come back. He turned to the others, meeting their gazes one by one. The fortress isn't at full strength, but we have enough supplies to last 2 months. They won't risk further damaging a potential asset. I've sent riders to ask for assistance from the elephant riders and other allies, but I don't hold out much hope. We will wait them out. The king paused, then spoke with grim resolve. Now, gather everyone in the square. I'll address the people. The preparations began immediately. Water was hauled from the river, grain and apples were gathered from the last harvest. Despite the dire situation, there was a glimmer of resolve in the king's actions. He still viewed surrender as a final option, not a foregone conclusion. The people, however, were uneasy. Some fled to Atlantia or River's Edge, but the majority stayed, bracing themselves for the unknown. The 4th day came and went. Tension hung in the air as the king and Adon debated whether to send a group of horsemen south toward Doka. After much deliberation, they decided to wait one more day. Arancad lay in his bed, his mind too restless to sleep. He dozed fitfully, waking every few minutes, unable to find any peace. As dawn broke, he stared at the light slowly creeping across the floor from the window, the passage of time relentless and inevitable. Suddenly, a distant sound cut through the silence. Boom, 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 boom. War drums. Arancad leaped from his bed, his heart pounding. He ran to the southern window and looked out just in time to see a glowing, molten ball descending toward the castle from a trebuchet. It grew larger and larger, its fiery glow illuminating the sky, before it crashed into the side of the fortress with a deafening roar. Instinctively, Arancad dove to the floor, narrowly avoiding the explosion. His heart raced in his chest as he lay there, wide-eyed. But when he opened his eyes again, the world around him was calm, and he found himself lying in his bed. He exhaled shakily, trying to shake off the disorienting feeling. A dream, he muttered, though his hands still trembled as he dressed quickly. Just then, there was a knock at his door. A rider with news has arrived, a servant announced. I don't suppose it's good news, Arancad said, his voice thick with dread. He awaits outside the castle, the servant replied. Bring him in. I'll meet him in the great hall, Arancad ordered, his tone tight. The rider entered, bowing low before speaking urgently. Forgive the early hour, my lord, but I thought you'd want to hear this. Well, out with it, Arancad demanded, his patience running thin. The army no longer marches toward us, the spy reported. They've turned back. They're marching west. West? Arancad's heart skipped a beat. Why west? What else do you know? All I know is that it has something to do with the walled city, the spy replied, his voice laden with mystery and unease. About 10 days after the developments in Ashdorn, Yushime and his band of followers walked toward the walled city, following the path leading to the western gate. Small houses and scattered dwellings dotted the landscape outside the city walls. The outer village was busy, but it was nothing compared to the bustle inside, especially on the eve of the new year, which coincidentally marked Udis, Bratari Day. Townsfolk waved at the visitors and pilgrims as they passed, their faces alight with festive cheer. I wonder if they've found a new village father to replace me, Yushime mused as they began to ascend the incline toward the city. With 4, perhaps, one of his followers teased. You flatter me, Opsos, Yushime laughed. I'd wager no more than 3. Everyone, listen. Let us have all of the tallest members gather around Yushime so he doesn't stand out, one of the band instructed. The group quickly complied, with the taller members moving closer to Yushime to help mask his height. What's the plan? Another follower asked, eager to know their next move. To celebrate the coming of the Friolsend, of course, Yushime replied, grinning. And hopefully have a little fun along the way. The group entered the city without issue. The guards, overwhelmed by the holiday crowds, didn't bother with thorough screenings. Inside the walls, fields and parks served as temporary campgrounds for the overflow of festival-goers. The streets were adorned with paintings of Udis Bratari, religious icons, and symbols. The air was alive with the sounds of bands playing and the scent of food wafted from the stalls. They made their way to a small park near the city center, where they sat to rest. After a while, Yushime gathered the group for a quick strategy session. Listen up, he began, his tone shifting to one of authority. Last year, every inn in the city was fully booked by this time, but, of course, that was the 100th anniversary. Hopefully it will not be so this year. Here's what I want. Split into groups of 4. We might not all find rooms in the same place, but if you do, leave 2 behind at the inn and send 2 back here to report what you found. We don't want to end up sleeping in the fields or outside the walls. I'll see you all in an hour. An hour later, they reconvened in the park, each returning with the same report. None of the inns or board houses had vacancies. Well, it looks like fate has dealt us a poor hand, Yushime said, his voice filled with frustration but tempered by determination. Let's vote on this. If you'd prefer to look for inns outside the walls, raise your hand. If you'd rather buy tents and camp within the city, in the sports field, keep your hand down. Yushime began counting hands. All right, looks like. He was interrupted by a man approaching the group. Clean-cut and calm, the man seemed to appear out of nowhere. Pardon me, he said, addressing Yushime. I overheard that you're having trouble finding lodging in the city. Is that correct? That's right, Yushime replied. My name is Ethelas. Why do you ask, if you don't mind me asking? Ethelas? Okay. The man smiled politely. I'm Gyolendas. I'm a student of the discipline, though I'm not really one for large celebrations. I was out handling some last-minute business when I happened upon your group. I have a large guest room that should accommodate all of you for the night if you'd like to stay. If you're sure, Yushime hesitated, his instincts still wary, but intrigued by the offer. Not a problem at all, said easily, with a warm smile. Yushime looked around at his companions, silently gauging their reactions. When they nodded their approval, he turned back to Gyolendas. Gyolendas. I think I've heard that name before. I run a company that buys, sells, and distributes grain. You must be from the city then. Gyolendas replied. Well, I've been here a few times, Yushime said with a nod. All right then, follow me, Gyolendas said. I'll show you to the room. I hear they have quite the celebration planned for tomorrow. Gyolendas led them to his home, located in the northeast corner of the city near the docks. It was one of the finest areas, second only to the royal quarter. His home was large, well-kept, and clearly one of the wealthier properties in the city. Once inside, Gyolendas ensured each of the band members had mattresses and bedding for the night. As the group settled in, Gyolendas took Yushime aside. I take it you're the leader of this group, Ethelas? Was it? Gyolendas asked, his tone thoughtful. I've got some business to attend to, but I'd love to chat with you later, maybe over a drink. It's the only thing I'll ask in return for the room. Yushime grinned. Well, how can I refuse? Gyolendas chuckled. Take care out there, won't you? Later that evening, Yushime and his followers joined the city's festivities. They listened to the bands, sampled the food, danced, and enjoyed the lively atmosphere. When they returned to Gyolendas' house to unwind, he had already returned from his errands and brought drinks for everyone. As promised, Yushime joined him upstairs. Come, sit, Gyolendas gestured, handing Yushime a drink. Yushime eyed the glass with hesitation. This is alcoholic. I really shouldn't. Oh, that's right. Village fathers aren't supposed to drink, Gyolendas teased, a knowing smile on his face. But you're not a village father anymore, are you? Am I right? Yushime chuckled. I didn't realize you recognized me. It's not that we cannot drink, but it should only be done in ritual. He paused and looked at the glass. Essentially, I suppose, I am not the village father at this particular time. Well, if you're not the village father anymore, then you've got no excuse, Gyolendas said, raising his glass. Let's make a toast. To Udis Bertari. And to free will. Yushime picked up his glass and clinked it against Gyolendas's, then they both took a drink. After a few more sips, Yushime leaned forward, his voice low with a thought that had been weighing on him. Gyolendas, would it be all right if I invited two from my group to join us? Opsos and Holtig, I've grown closest to them during our travels. I'd like to have them here for drinks as well. Gyolendas nodded, a welcoming smile on his face. Of course, the more the merrier. As the four of them drank and conversed, they touched on topics ranging from current events to the future, even reminiscing about how things used to be. Yushime seemed lost in thought as the conversation meandered, but eventually, he stood and announced, I'd like to go out into the city and mingle a bit. Gyolendas raised an eyebrow, a trace of concern in his voice. Are you sure that's a good idea? The wrong people might recognize you. I feel it's necessary, Yushime replied firmly. I doubt they would arrest the village father on the eve of the festival. We'll be discreet. If you must, Gyolendas said with a reluctant sigh, then do it. Holtig, look after him, will you? Get him back in one piece. So, Yushime, Holtig, Opsos, and two others made their way into the city. They joined a growing crowd of devotees celebrating the holiday. Yushime greeted familiar faces, apologizing for his absence and shaking hands with the townsfolk. Word quickly spread that the former village father had returned. Before long, a small mob had gathered around them, eager to speak with Yushime. The situation quickly grew overwhelming, and the group found themselves surrounded. Recognizing the danger, they made a hasty exit, sprinting through back alleys until they were safely out of sight. They returned to Gyolendas' house, hearts racing from the close call. The next day, they kept a low profile, having breakfast provided by Gyolendas. The morning passed uneventfully, but Yushime had a sense of anticipation building within him. I have a feeling, he said, speaking to the group, that today is the day. It's as if all our wandering has led us to this moment. I can't explain it, but I feel that something monumental is about to unfold. After breakfast, they made their way to the southern gate of the city, where the procession was scheduled to begin. According to tradition, the procession would circle the village father's house in a clockwise direction before heading back to the southern gate and continuing up the main street. There, the village father would give his speech, and the crowd would await his words. The group mingled with the other devotees, keeping a low profile. Yushime crouched, assuming a prayerful posture to avoid drawing attention. As the procession completed its circle and began heading up the main street, the crowd grew silent, their eyes fixed on the balcony where the new village father was expected to appear. When the new village father stepped onto the balcony and began his speech, the crowd hung on every word. But after only 2 minutes, a voice from somewhere in the crowd began to chant, "Yushime! Yushime!" The chant spread like wildfire, growing louder and more insistent. Apsos turned to Yushime, his expression urgent. "Let's go," he whispered. Yushime's heart raced, but he nodded with conviction. "Yes, this is it. The moment the gods have prepared for me." The moment seemed to pulsate with providence. The three of them, Holtig, Apsos, and Yushime, slipped around the back of the building and entered. The building was guarded, but Yushime knew exactly how to move undetected. They made their way up to the upstairs room, where the balcony overlooked the crowd. As Yushime stepped into the room, he positioned himself behind the new village father, towering over him. The crowd, sensing something was happening, fell into a hushed silence. Then, as Yushime appeared, the roar of applause erupted. At first, the new village father thought the applause was for him, but his face quickly faltered as he remembered that it was not customary for the crowd to cheer so early in the speech. He turned around to see Yushime, standing tall behind him. The village father paused, then gave a brief nod, stepping aside without a word. He disappeared behind the curtain, leaving Yushime to step forward into the spotlight. The crowd's cheers grew louder, deafening in their intensity, as the former village father took center stage. He motioned for the crowd to be silent. "Thank you," he said, looking around and making eye contact with as many as he could, before beginning his speech. "Thank you all. Britarians, brothers, sisters, travelers. I owe each of you my sincerest apology. I am sorry for abandoning the city, for abandoning you. I have always told you that the first step in the breaking of the fate is to come to know yourselves, to know who you are. But I forgot who I was. I won't make excuses for why I left, but some of you may know. When I was out on the road, I met a man who reminded me of who I was. You see, he told me the story of how he grew up in the slums of Railsville. And like his ancestors before him, every day was a struggle just to survive. Fear of being robbed or killed or starving were the norm. That was his fate. But through these teachings, the teachings we are here to celebrate on this day, he broke free of his destiny and became a successful business owner and no longer needs to live in fear. He told me I changed his life, but I say no. He reminded me of who I was, just as I try to remind you of who you are. I can't change your destiny. Udis Bratari can't change your destiny. Only you can change your destiny. We can only point the way. We can give you the tools, the sledgehammer, as some have put it. It is you who must pick up the sledgehammer and smash the walls of your own destiny." A few in the crowd whistled and quietly clapped. Usually, all such displays are held until after the speech, but this day was different. Yushime waited for the crowd to become silent again. "And those walls. The walls of destiny cannot confine you. The walls of destiny cannot define you. And let me remind you that these walls of yellow and green that surround the city, can neither define or confine you either. And you all know that they try, especially now. It is true that the walls are made up of individual stones. And some would try to convince you that the individual stone by itself is of little importance, but don't be fooled. Without individual stones, there could be no wall. People expect us to believe the unbelievable. And yes, I am talking about the election of the steward. I am talking about the idea that wizards were responsible for burning down the College of Natural Science. Or that we must be afraid of invading barbarians from the north. I have not seen one. Have you? I will refrain from any more political talk, but these things needed to be said because no one else seems to want to talk about them. Now, let us recite the Bana. Yushime and the crowd bowed their heads in prayer. But just as they began, a sudden, sharp whistle cut through the air. An arrow, dark and swift, flew from somewhere in the crowd, or perhaps from a building, and struck Yushime in the shoulder. He stumbled backward, crashing to the ground, and the crowd gasped in horror. "Over there," someone shouted, pointing to a side street. "The archer is over there." "I saw someone in the window," another person cried, pointing to a nearby building. Panic spread like wildfire. The crowd erupted into chaos, pushing and shoving in all directions, while the replacement village father appeared on the balcony, his voice barely audible over the growing din. "Please, remain calm. Let us not give way to our impulses," he urged, but no one listened. People scrambled in search of the attacker, following every lead, whether true or not. Apsos and Holtig quickly moved Yushime, his face pale with pain, to safety. Lochnia and 2 other followers arrived to assist. "There's a secret passage in the next room," Yushime gasped, struggling to speak. "It leads underground." Without hesitation, they helped him to the tunnel. Grabbing a lantern which hung upon the wall, they emerged through a trap door farther north, away from the frantic crowd. Lochnia examined the wound. "What shall we do now?" she asked. "Yolenda's," Yushime muttered, before his eyes fluttered shut and he lost consciousness. "Let's get him to Yolenda's," Opso said quickly. "He may be able to help us." They arrived at Yolenda's house, where he was waiting at the door. "I feared this would happen," he said, leading them inside. "Let's get him inside, quickly. My personal physician is just across the street," he added, signaling for one of the followers to fetch him. "Holtig, come with me," Yolenda's ordered, leading the way up to the top floor. They looked out at the chaos unfolding to the south. "More guards from the royal quarter," Holtig shouted, pointing to the southeast. "They're going to slaughter those people." "Don't worry about them," Yolenda's replied calmly. "Come, let's hurry." The two rushed down into the center of town, where the streets were filled with confusion and unrest. Some groups of people were shouting, "The steward is illegitimate. Down with the steward," while others searched for Yushime or the man who had shot him. Nearby, a carriage loaded with weapons, swords, bows, and arrows had been inexplicably left in plain view, fueling the uprising. The crowd quickly seized the weapons and began to fight with the royal guards. As Yolenda's moved through the streets, a group of his loyal guards approached him. There were 12 of them. "I need half of you to secure the west and south gates." "Hurry," Yolenda's ordered. "The rest of you stay here and help the people. Holtig, come with me." He spotted a group of townsfolk moving toward the royal quarter. "You there?" Yolenda's called, his voice sharp. "Do not try to enter the royal quarter." One man turned, defiant. "Why should we listen to you?" "Because I don't want you to get killed," Yolenda's replied, his tone unwavering. "If you want to strike at the steward, the best way for now is to set the courthouse on fire. It's easily accessible from Gate Street." The city was not prepared for the battle that had erupted. It had been over a century since Ash Dorn had seen such violence. Within hours, the Breterians had taken control of the entire city, except for the royal quarter. All the gates and entrances were sealed, and the courthouse was in flames. "What now?" Holtig asked, glancing at Yolenda's. "We must storm the royal quarter," Yolenda's said, his voice hardening with resolve. "We need to do it quickly. If we can force the king to flee, we will have the city." "But then what?" Holtig asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Where do we go after that?" Yolenda's gave him a grim smile. "Our wayward footsteps are best planted without excessive calculation, my young friend. We round up the strongest, healthiest men we can find. Then we enter through the ruins of the courthouse and take the royal quarter." Holtig set to work, gathering 200 armed men, and they stormed the royal quarter through the smoking remains of the courthouse. The royal guard held their ground for some time, but they were outnumbered. After a fierce battle, many lives were lost on both sides. By midnight, the royal quarter had fallen. Meanwhile, at Yolenda's house, Yushime's wound had been cleaned and stitched. Though he was in stable condition, he regained consciousness and immediately asked about the events of the night. "This isn't what was supposed to happen," Yushime said, his voice filled with guilt. "I didn't mean for any of this. People are dying, and it's my fault." "How could you have known this would happen?" one of his companions asked, trying to comfort him. "I should have known," Yushime muttered, staring at the floor. "I should have seen it coming." His eyes were filled with anguish. "This city, this beautiful city, is burning because of me." He sank into despair, unable to look outside, lost in his own torment. At the village father's house, Yolenda's, his chief guard, Opso's, Holtig, and a few others gathered to discuss the situation. "So, what now?" Opsos asked, his voice heavy with concern. "The COL army is only a mile away." "Most of them are marching on Ash Dorn as we speak," Yolenda said. "The rest won't attack the city directly. They won't risk damaging the city or its grain stores. They'll likely camp around the city and begin a siege." "But what then?" Holtig asked, his face grim. "There's no way out of this. Nowhere for us to go." Yolenda's didn't flinch. "Do not despair. We won't need to go anywhere. Not for a while. But either way, this is the situation we are in, and we must ensure our survival, at least to the ability which we can ensure it. They will most certainly present a show of force, and so must we," he said, placing a reassuring hand on Holtig's shoulder before continuing. "There are 2 trebuchets and 1 ballista in the industrial section, as well as materials to reinforce the gates. I need them ready as soon as possible. We need eyes on top of every wall, immediately. Meanwhile, we must address the townsfolk. We need to determine who is with us and who is against us." Yolenda's words steeled the group. Alongside the 800 pilgrims, nearly 300 young men who lived within the walls stepped forward to take up arms. Archers stationed themselves on the parapets, and the castle doors were reinforced. The trebuchets and ballistas were wheeled into position, their crews prepared for the inevitable siege. The town architect was brought before Yolenda's, along with anyone who had knowledge of the city's defenses. Those who seemed uncooperative were temporarily detained. "Can you fill the moat?" Yolendas asked the architect. I don't know, the architect replied uncertainly. The moats haven't been in use for 50 years. It might be possible, but I can't guarantee it will work. If we can't close the gates after, it might flood outer Idriaxlin, possibly the tunnels. I understand, Yolendas said, cutting him off. All I ask is that you try. Take as many men as you need. The architect hurried to the back of the city. After some effort and much oiling of the rusted valves, he managed to pry them open. Water from Lake Idriaxis poured into the long-dried moat, filling it quickly. Once it was full, he closed the valve. The city was now as ready as it could be for a prolonged siege. Siege.